There's a particular quality to twilight in eastern Kentucky, the way the mountains hold on to the last light, while the valleys surrender to shadow first. In the summer of 1987, that twilight carried the thick, honeyed weight of humidity, the kind that made your clothes stick to your skin and turned every breath into work. The cicadas hadn't started yet. It was that suspended moment between seasons, late May bleeding into June, when the dogwoods had finished blooming but the heat hadn't yet become unbearable. In Harlan County, people sat on their porches in the evenings, drinking sweet tea from mason jars, watching their children play in yards that still held the day's warmth in the grass. Harlan was coal country, always had been. By 1987, the boom years were long behind it, but the identity remained, a town of families who'd gone into the mines for generations, who knew the weight of the earth above them and the darkness below. The mountains here didn't just surround the town. They defined it, created it, held it in a cupped palm of ridges and hollows where the morning fog could linger until noon. Main Street ran through the center like a spine, the courthouse at one end, the old theater that had closed 3 years prior at the other. Between them, a hardware store that still kept charge accounts, a diner where the same 6 people sat at the counter every morning at 6, a pharmacy with a soda fountain that teenagers claimed on Friday nights. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your family, your business, where leaving your door unlocked wasn't foolishness but custom, where children roamed freely because 100 eyes were always watching, always keeping track, where the greatest dangers seemed to be the mines themselves, the cave-ins, the black lung, the economic uncertainty, not anything that might come from within the community itself. Sarah Lynn Brewster was 14 that spring, though she carried herself with the composure of someone older. She had her mother's dark hair, thick and straight, usually pulled back in a ponytail that swung when she walked. Her father's eyes, hazel with flecks of gold that caught the light. She was tall for her age, had been since elementary school, which had made her self-conscious until she'd grown into it around 12 or 13. By 14, she'd learned to carry that height with something approaching grace. She played basketball for Harlan High, point guard, and had a reputation for seeing plays before they developed, for threading passes through impossible angles. But basketball was for winter. Summer was for different rhythms. Sarah Lynn worked afternoons at the Dairy Queen on Highway 421, saving money for a car she hoped to buy by her 16th birthday. She'd calculated it all out in a notebook she kept under her bed. Hours worked, dollars earned, projected savings by month. She was methodical like that, a planner. Her mother, Patricia, called her the little accountant, with affection and exasperation in equal measure. Her father, James, a foreman at the lynch mine, saw in her a determination he recognized and respected. Her younger brother, Michael, aged 10, thought she was bossy and occasionally infuriating, but would have defended her to his last breath. The Brewsters lived on Clover Street, a row of modest houses with chain-link fences and carports, gardens where tomatoes grew and tire planters and marigolds bordered the walkways. Their house was the pale yellow one with the porch swing James had built from plans in a workbench magazine. Patricia kept flower pots along the railing, petunias and geraniums that she deadheaded every evening after dinner. It was a house that smelled like whatever Patricia was baking, that echoed with the television news at 6 o'clock and Michael's toy cars racing across the hardwood floors. Sarah Lynn had a best friend, Kelly Jo Parsons, who lived 3 streets over. They'd been inseparable since 3rd grade, when Kelly Jo had moved to Harlan from Virginia, and Sarah Lynn had been assigned to show her around the school. They had the kind of friendship that required no explanation, could sit in comfortable silence or talk for hours about nothing. That summer they were obsessed with music, making mixtapes, learning lyrics, imagining futures that stretched beyond the mountains to cities they'd only seen in magazines. They talked about college, about leaving, but also about coming back. because that's what you did in Harlan. You might leave, but the mountains always called you home. On May 28, 1987, a Thursday that dawned clear and warm, Sarah Lynn finished her shift at the Dairy Queen at 9 p.m. She'd worked since 4, serving soft-serve cones and blizzards to a steady stream of customers seeking relief from the heat that had spiked unexpectedly into the mid-80s. Kelly Jo had stopped by around 8, ordering a cherry-dipped cone and sitting at one of the outdoor tables, waiting. They'd made plans. Loose plans, the kind 14-year-olds made to walk down to the old railroad trestle where kids sometimes hung out in the evenings. Nothing formal, nothing dangerous. Just a walk in the twilight, maybe sitting on the tracks sharing a can of Coke, talking until they had to head home before curfew. Sarah Lynn's manager, Doug Hendricks, a 22-year-old who managed the Dairy Queen with the seriousness of someone running a Fortune 500 company, remembered her clocking out. Remembered her calling out, "See you tomorrow, Doug," as she pushed through the door, the little bell jingling. Remembered her joining Kelly Jo at the table, the two of them laughing about something, heads bent together in that way teenage girls have, sharing secrets or jokes in a language made of half-sentences and knowing looks. Multiple witnesses saw them walking south on Highway 421 toward the railroad tracks. The Hendersons driving home from church. Deputy Mark Rollins on patrol. Mrs. Eunice Campbell sitting on her porch with her sister. All remembered the same thing. 2 girls, Sarah Lynn in her Dairy Queen uniform, red polo shirt and khaki shorts, Kelly Jo in cutoff jeans and a purple tank top, walking close together, animated, alive. Just 2 girls on a Thursday evening in May, when the sky was turning that particular shade of violet blue that meant full dark was still an hour away. No one saw them reach the railroad tracks. No one saw them turn onto the path that led to the trestle. No one saw what happened next. By 11 p.m., when Sarah Lynn hadn't come home and Patricia Brewster's first flutter of concern was growing into something sharper, something with teeth, the mountains had already swallowed the twilight completely. The cicadas had started their nightly chorus. The air had cooled just enough to raise goosebumps on bare arms. And somewhere in those hollows, in that darkness between stars and earth, the wait of silence had begun. The incident. Patricia Brewster was not a woman prone to panic. She'd lived in Harlan her entire life, raised in a household where worry was considered wasteful energy better spent on practical action. But at 10:45 p.m. on May 28, 1987, standing in her kitchen with the yellow rotary phone pressed to her ear, listening to Kelly Jo's mother Helen say that Kelly Jo wasn't home either, something cold and terrible unfurled in her chest. She said they were just going to the trestle. Helen's voice crackled over the line. Said they'd be back by 10:30 at the latest. The trestle. The old railroad bridge that spanned the Cumberland Fork, abandoned since the early 70s when the mining operation had shifted and the trains had stopped running this route. Kids went there. Patricia knew this, had gone there herself as a teenager. It wasn't dangerous, not really. The drop wasn't that high. The structure was solid. It was just a place where teenagers went to be away from adult eyes for a little while, to feel the illicit thrill of trespassing somewhere they technically weren't supposed to be, even though everyone knew they did it and mostly looked the other way. James had already driven down there, Patricia told Helen, had taken his truck, his flashlight, driven the route he figured the girls would have walked. He'd been gone 20 minutes. The plan was, he'd check the obvious places, and if he didn't find them, they'd start making more calls. When James returned at 11:15, alone, the kitchen light casting harsh shadows across his face, Patricia knew before he spoke that this was no longer about teenagers losing track of time. "Nothing," he said. "No sign of them. I walked out onto the trestle, called their names, checked the paths down to the creek. Nothing. They called Helen and Robert Parsons back. Robert would drive the route from their end. They'd call other parents, ask if anyone had seen the girls, if they'd stopped anywhere else. James would go back out, check different areas. Patricia would stay by the phone in case Sarah Lynn called. Maybe they'd gone to someone else's house. Maybe there was a simple explanation. But in her bones, in that place where mothers carry an instinct older than language, Patricia knew. Something was wrong. By midnight, 6 vehicles were driving through Harlan and the surrounding areas, flashlight beams sweeping through darkness, voices calling Sarah Lynn and Kelly Jo into the indifferent night. The Dairy Queen parking lot, the high school, the park, the library, every friend's house they could think of, the little strip of businesses along Main Street, the churches, the elementary school playground. Nothing. At 1:15 a.m., James Brewster walked into the Harlan County Sheriff's Office and reported his daughter missing. Deputy Travis Coleman, working the night shift, took the report with the weary efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Teenage girls, he noted. Friends. Last seen at 9 p.m. Expected home by 10:30. Both parents reporting them missing. They probably just lost track of time, Coleman said, the standard reassurance. Or went somewhere else and didn't call. Happens all the time. They always turn up. But he made the report. Called Sheriff Roy Dixon at home. Woke him up. Dixon, a man who'd been sheriff for 16 years and had seen enough to know when something felt off, told him to call in whoever was available. Start a proper search at first light. In the meantime, alert the highway patrol, check with the hospital, and start organizing volunteers. By 2 a.m., the word was spreading through Harlan the way news always spread. Through phone lines and worry, house to house, person to person. Sarah Lynn Brewster and Kelly Jo Parsons were missing. Last seen around 9:15 p.m., heading toward the railroad trestle. Hadn't come home. The first night, no one slept. Patricia sat at her kitchen table, the phone within arm's reach, making coffee that no one drank. James went out again at 3 a.m., couldn't sit still, drove the same routes again looking for something, anything. Michael, confused and frightened, sat on the stairs in his pajamas, watching his mother's face for clues about how scared he should be. Helen and Robert Parsons paced their living room, replaying every conversation, every detail from the day. Had Kelly Jo seemed upset about something? Had she mentioned anyone bothering her? Any plans she hadn't shared? Nothing. Just a normal day. Just a normal 14-year-old girl going to meet her friend after work. At 5:30 a.m., as the first gray light began to seep over the mountains, painting the ridges in charcoal and ash, more than 60 volunteers had gathered at the sheriff's office. Miners coming off the night shift. Teachers. Shop owners. Teenagers who were Sarah Lynn and Kelly Jo's classmates. People who'd never met the girls but knew their families, or knew someone who did, or simply couldn't stand the thought of children lost in the dark. Sheriff Dixon organized them into groups. Grid searches. The railroad tracks and trestle as the starting point, expanding outward. The creek beds, the woods, the old mining roads, every abandoned building, every hollow and ridge. He called in search dogs from Cumberland, put out an alert to all surrounding counties, set up a command post in the high school gymnasium. By 6 a.m., as the sun finally crested the eastern ridges and lit the valley in that tentative morning light that felt too pure, too innocent for what it was illuminating, the search was in full force. They found Kelly Jo's shoe first. At 7:42 a.m., volunteer searcher Marcus Webb, a history teacher at the high school, discovered a white canvas sneaker, Keds, worn and grass-stained, on the embankment 15 feet below the railroad trestle, half hidden in tall weeds. Helen Parsons identified it immediately as Kelly Jo's. She'd bought them for her at the Kmart in Middlesboro just 3 weeks earlier. One shoe. The second shoe was never found. At 8:15 a.m., another volunteer found Sarah Lynn's Dairy Queen visor in the creek, about 50 yards downstream from the trestle. The red fabric was waterlogged but intact, the white DQ logo still visible. And then nothing else. No more clothing, no more signs, just those two items, as if the girls had partially dissolved, leaving only fragments behind. The search dogs arrived at 9 a.m. German shepherds trained in tracking, handlers from the Kentucky Search and Rescue. They picked up scents on the railroad tracks, followed them out onto the trestle, down to the embankment. Then the trails went cold. Confused. The dogs circled, returned to the same spots, whined in frustration. One of the handlers, a woman named Diane Morrison who'd been doing this work for 12 years, pulled Sheriff Dixon aside. "The trails stop," she said quietly. "They don't fade, they don't continue. They stop, like the girls just vanished, or were carried, or put into a vehicle." By noon, on May 29th, 12 hours after James Brewster had first driven to the trestle looking for his daughter, the nature of the search had changed. This was no longer about teenagers who'd wandered off and gotten lost. This was about something darker. The FBI field office in Lexington was contacted. Special agents would arrive by evening. The search expanded to include a criminal investigation. Deputies began canvassing, taking statements, compiling a timeline. Who had seen the girls? Where exactly? What time? Did anyone see a vehicle near the trestle? Any strangers in town? Any unusual activity? Patricia Brewster sat in her living room, surrounded by women from the church, bringing casseroles and comfort she couldn't feel. The television was on, local news, already running stories about the missing girls. School photos filling the screen. Sarah Lynn's basketball team photo from the previous season. Kelly Jo's 7th grade class picture. Both girls smiling, frozen in a moment before the world had teeth. James was still out searching. He'd been out for 13 hours straight, walking the same paths, checking the same places, as if by sheer force of will he could make his daughter reappear. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice hoarse from calling her name. Other fathers walked with him, men from the mines, men who understood that sometimes the earth swallowed things and didn't give them back. The high school gymnasium became a hive of activity. Maps covered the walls, marked with grid patterns and search zones. Volunteers came in shifts, some searching, some manning phones, some making sandwiches and coffee for the searchers. The local radio station, WHLN, broadcast regular updates, appeals for information, instructions for volunteers. The newspaper, the Harlan Daily Enterprise, put out a special afternoon edition with the girls' photos on the front page. By sunset on the first day, more than 300 people had participated in the search. They'd covered approximately 15 square miles of terrain. They'd interviewed over 100 witnesses. They'd found one shoe and one visor. And as the sun set again, dropping below the western ridges and pulling its light back like a blanket, Sarah Lynn Brewster and Kelly Jo Parsons had been missing for 24 hours. The mountains held their secrets close. The search investigation. The FBI agents arrived on Friday afternoon, May 29th, bringing with them a systematic approach that both reassured and terrified the families. Special Agent in Charge Daniel Patterson and his partner, Agent Linda Morales, set up operations in the sheriff's office, transforming it into an investigative command center. Maps, photographs, timeline charts appeared on the walls. Every movement of the girls' last day was reconstructed, verified, documented. Patterson was methodical, clinical, a man in his late 40s with silver-shot hair and a manner that suggested he'd worked too many cases like this. Morales was younger, sharper around the edges, with eyes that missed nothing. Together, they began the painstaking process of building a case file on girls they'd never met, in a town they'd never visited, searching for answers in a landscape that resisted revelation. The weekend brought more searchers. By Saturday, the count had reached over 500 volunteers. The search radius expanded to 25 square miles. The National Guard sent a helicopter with thermal imaging. Dive teams from 3 counties arrived to search the Cumberland Fork and every creek, pond, and cistern within the search area. Every abandoned mine shaft, and there were dozens, was checked and rechecked. The community response was overwhelming. Local restaurants donated food. Churches organized prayer vigils. The high school set up a fund for the families. Strangers from neighboring counties arrived to help search. A woman from Virginia drove 6 hours to drop off homemade quilts for Patricia and Helen, saying only that she was a mother too. But beneath the solidarity, something else was growing. Suspicion. It started small. Whispers about strangers who'd been seen around town in the days before the girls disappeared. A man at the Dairy Queen who'd asked Sarah Lynn uncomfortable questions about her schedule, or so someone had heard. A vehicle that didn't belong parked near the trestle on Thursday evening. The details were vague, third-hand, impossible to verify, but they circulated anyway, gaining substance through repetition. The FBI interviewed Doug Hendricks, the Dairy Queen manager, 3 times. His timelines matched. His alibi, he'd gone home after closing at 10 p.m., his mother confirmed, was solid. But people talked anyway. Why had he been so interested in Sarah Lynn's work schedule? Why did he always assign her to the window, where she'd be visible from outside? They investigated a drifter who'd been seen camping near the railroad tracks 2 weeks earlier. Found him in Tennessee, brought him back for questioning. He had no connection to the girls, no knowledge of them, and an alibi placing him in Virginia on May 28th. They looked at Robert Parsons, Kelly Jo's father, because statistically family members were always suspects. His marriage to Helen was rocky. Neighbors confirmed they fought. He'd been the last person to see Kelly Jo before she left that evening, had even driven her to the Dairy Queen to meet Sarah Lynn. But his timeline checked out. His grief appeared genuine, and there was no evidence, no motive, nothing but the cold statistics that said they had to look at him. Every registered sex offender within 100 miles was questioned. Every vehicle reported near the trestle was tracked down and accounted for. Every tip called into the hotline, and there were hundreds, was investigated. They found nothing. By the second week, Agent Patterson held a press conference that the entire town watched, either in person or on television. He stood behind a podium in the courthouse, photos of Sarah Lynn and Kelly Jo enlarged on poster boards beside him. "We believe these girls were abducted," he said, the words landing like stones in still water. "We believe someone took them from the area near the railroad trestle on the evening of May 28th. We believe this person is local or familiar with the area. We believe someone in this community has information that could help us." He appealed for witnesses, for anyone who'd seen anything unusual, a vehicle, a person, anything that seemed out of place. He emphasized that even details that seemed insignificant might be crucial. The tips flooded in. People remembered things, or thought they did. The mind plays tricks when you're desperate to help, when you want so badly to have the piece that solves the puzzle. Deputies followed every lead, no matter how tenuous, drove hundreds of miles chasing ghosts and shadows. Patricia Brewster stopped sleeping entirely. She sat in Sarah Lynn's room for hours, touching her daughter's things. The basketball trophies on the shelf, the Duran Duran poster on the wall, the notebook under the bed with its careful calculations of savings and dreams. She left everything exactly as it was, as if moving anything would acknowledge that Sarah Lynn might not come back to need it. James returned to work at the mine after 2 weeks because bills had to be paid, and sitting at home made him want to tear the walls apart. But he was a ghost underground, moving through the darkness by rote, his mind always above ground, always searching. Michael stopped talking. Just stopped. His teachers called home, concerned. He'd sit in class staring at nothing, or sometimes at Sarah Lynn's empty desk 3 rows over. He'd wake up screaming in the night, dreaming of his sister calling for help, and Patricia would hold him until he fell back asleep, both of them hollow with helplessness. Helen Parsons started driving the same route every day. Home to the Dairy Queen to the Trestle back home. The same loop over and over, as if by repeating Kelly Jo's last journey, she could somehow change its ending. Robert tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. Couldn't listen. Movement was all that kept her from fragmenting completely. The summer aged without them. June gave way to July, and the heat became oppressive, pressing down on the mountains like a weight. The search continued, but the numbers dwindled. 500 became 200 became 50. People had jobs, families, lives that demanded attention. The news crews left. The FBI agents returned to Lexington, though the case remained active, though Patterson called Sheriff Dixon weekly for updates. In late July, a psychic from Florida contacted the sheriff's office, claiming to have visions of the girls. She described a location, a hollow with 3 oak trees and a creek running through it. Dozens of places matched that description, but they searched them anyway. Found nothing. In August, a body was discovered in a neighboring county. For 6 terrible hours, until dental records confirmed it was a different girl who'd been missing for years, Patricia and Helen lived through their worst nightmare. Then they returned to the previous nightmare, the one where there was no body, no proof, no ending. The first anniversary of the disappearance brought a smaller vigil than expected. People wanted to remember, wanted to show support. But grief is exhausting, and this kind, the grief with no resolution, was particularly draining. Patricia and Helen stood together at the railroad trestle, now marked with a small memorial of flowers and stuffed animals that local teenagers maintained. They didn't speak. What was there to say that hadn't been said 1,000 times already? By 1990, 3 years gone, the case was effectively cold. The FBI file remained open but inactive. Sheriff Dixon, who'd taken it personally, who'd worked it harder than any case in his career, retired in 1989, and the new sheriff, while sympathetic, had other priorities. The physical evidence, the shoe, the visor, sat in a storage room in the courthouse, carefully preserved but forgotten. Harlan learned to live with the hole in its center. The high school held a memorial assembly every May 28th. The basketball team retired Sarah Lynn's number. The town planted 2 dogwood trees in the park, their nameplates reading simply Sarah Lynn and Kelly Jo. The families stayed because leaving would mean abandoning hope, and hope was all they had left. Patricia developed a ritual. Every morning, she'd walk to the end of Clover Street and look toward the mountains, as if Sarah Lynn might come walking back from them. Every morning, the mountains looked back with their ancient indifference. James grew quieter, older. The lines around his eyes deepened not from laughter but from squinting into the darkness underground and finding nothing, looking for answers in seams of coal that held only carbon and pressure and time. Michael graduated high school in 1995, left Harlan for college in Louisville, called home every Sunday, but never stayed for long when he visited. The house held too many ghosts. Helen and Robert Parsons divorced in 1992. The loss had opened a chasm between them that no bridge could span. Robert moved to Tennessee. Helen stayed because mothers stay, because some part of her believed that Kelly Jo might come home and need to find her there. The town's memory faded at the edges. New people moved in who'd never known the girls. Children who'd been infants in 1987 grew up hearing the story as local lore. The two girls who vanished, the unsolved mystery, the town's open wound. But it was history to them, not immediate pain. The missing posters, once everywhere, yellowed and were taken down. The case files gathered dust. But cold cases are never truly cold. They're frozen, suspended, waiting for technology to advance, for someone's conscience to break, for a detail missed the first time to suddenly illuminate, for time itself to shake something loose. The wait would be long, 38 years long. The turning point. Time did to Harlan what it does to all places, reshaped it slowly, cell by cell, until the town of 2025 bore only surface resemblance to the town of 1987. The mines mostly closed, hollowed out, or too expensive to work. The population dwindled. Main Street emptied, storefronts boarded up. The old theater was demolished. The Dairy Queen closed in 2003, leaving a vacant lot where weeds grew through cracks in the concrete. Young people left for cities with jobs and futures, and the ones who stayed grew gray, tending to the past. But some things remained. The mountains, of course, indifferent and eternal. The railroad trestle, now truly abandoned, rusting and dangerous, fenced off with signs warning of structural failure. The memorial trees in the park, their trunks thick now, their branches reaching. And the memory, carried by those who'd lived through it, who couldn't forget. Patricia Brewster was 71 in 2025, still living in the yellow house on Clover Street, though James had passed from black lung in 2018. Her hair was white, her hands trembled with arthritis, but every morning she still walked to the end of the street and looked toward the mountains. Michael called every Sunday from Louisville, where he worked as an accountant, his mother's son, and had a family of his own. He'd named his daughter Sarah, never explaining but never having to. Helen Parsons had moved to a small apartment on the south side of town, closer to the church where she'd spent thousands of hours praying for impossible things. She was 69, living on Social Security and the small settlement from her divorce. She kept every picture of Kelly Jo, every news clipping about the case, in a large plastic tub in her closet. Sometimes she'd take them out and go through them, touching the face of her daughter frozen at 14, forever young while Helen had grown old waiting. The case file sat in the Harlan County Sheriff's Office, now digitized but still unsolved. Sheriff Amanda Reynolds, elected in 2020, had read through it when she took office. She'd been 7 years old in 1987, living 3 counties over, but she'd heard the story. Everyone in eastern Kentucky had heard the story. In January 2025, Detective Marcus Webb, the same Marcus Webb who'd been a high school teacher in 1987, who'd found Kelly Jo's shoe, who'd never quite been able to let the case go, contacted Sheriff Reynolds with an idea. Webb had retired from teaching in 2010 and gone back to school, earning a degree in criminal justice, joining the department as a detective at age 57 because some questions wouldn't let you rest. "I want to reopen it," he said, sitting across from Reynolds' desk. "With everything we have now, DNA technology, genetic genealogy, database cross-referencing, maybe we can find something we missed." Reynolds had been thinking the same thing. Cold cases across the country were being cracked using new techniques that didn't exist in 1987. Genealogy databases that could trace DNA to distant relatives, building family trees backward to identify suspects. Advanced forensic analysis that could extract usable samples from evidence that would have been useless 30 years ago. The problem was money. The county budget was tight, and genetic genealogy wasn't cheap. But Reynolds made calls. found grants for cold case investigations, reached out to the FBI, where a new generation of agents was eager to close old cases, contacted private labs that specialized in forensic genetic genealogy. In March 2025, Kelly Jo's shoe, preserved all these years in an evidence box, was sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia for analysis. The visor followed. Both items were tested for DNA that wasn't from the girls. And they found something. On the shoe's laces, preserved by the canvas and the conditions of storage, were trace amounts of epithelial cells, skin cells, that didn't match Kelly Jo. The DNA was degraded but usable, enough to create a profile, enough to search. The profile was run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. No hit. The person who touched that shoe had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA collection. But CODIS wasn't the only option anymore. Dr. Ellen Grayson, a forensic genetic genealogist contracted by Parabon, uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people voluntarily uploaded their DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. The profile wasn't a match to anyone in the database, but that wasn't the point. The point was to find partial matches, third cousins, fourth cousins, distant relatives who shared small segments of DNA with the unknown person. It took 3 weeks of analysis, building a family tree backward and forward, tracking births and deaths and marriages across 4 generations. Dr. Grayson worked with census records, obituaries, social media, public records, building a web of connections that narrowed and narrowed until she had a cluster of families who could have contributed to that DNA profile. On April 18, 2025, she presented her findings to Sheriff Reynolds and Detective Webb. The DNA on Kelly Jo's shoe belonged to a male, almost certainly someone who'd been in Harlan in May 1987, and based on the genetic markers, likely between 20 and 40 years old at that time. The family tree pointed to one of 3 possible men. 2 were deceased. The third was alive, age 61, and still living in Kentucky. His name was Thomas Wayne Carver. Webb's hands went numb when he heard the name. He knew Thomas Carver. Everyone in Harlan knew Thomas Carver. In 1987, Carver had been 24 years old, working as a mechanic at a garage on the north end of town. He'd been interviewed during the initial investigation. Everyone who'd been near the trestle or the Dairy Queen had been interviewed, but nothing had flagged him as a suspect. He'd been cooperative, had claimed he was home alone that evening, had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket. He'd lived in Harlan his entire life, graduated from Harlan High in 1981. Quiet guy, people said. Kept to himself. Good with cars. He'd moved away in 1989, left the area entirely, and hadn't been back since. But he was still alive, still out there, and his DNA was on Kelly Jo Parsons' shoe. Sheriff Reynolds made the decision immediately. They needed more. They needed to confirm this genetic genealogy with a direct DNA sample from Carver himself. They needed to be absolutely certain before they knocked on this man's door 38 years later. The FBI was brought back in. Special Agent Rachel Kim, who specialized in cold cases, took point. They located Carver in Lexington, Kentucky, where he'd been living since 2005. He worked at a Toyota dealership. Divorced twice, no children, no arrests, no criminal record of any kind. On May 1, 2025, a tactical surveillance unit began watching Thomas Wayne Carver. They needed a discard sample, something he'd touched and thrown away that they could legally collect and test. A coffee cup, a cigarette butt, a discarded straw. On May 3rd, Carver stopped at a Starbucks on his way to work, ordered a venti coffee, sat in his truck drinking it, threw the cup in the parking lot trash can when he was done. Agents retrieved the cup 3 minutes later. The DNA was extracted, sequenced, and compared to the profile from Kelly Jo's shoe. On May 8, 2025, the lab confirmed a match. The DNA on Kelly Jo Parsons' shoe, 38 years old, belonged to Thomas Wayne Carver. Sheriff Reynolds called Patricia Brewster and Helen Parsons simultaneously on separate lines, asking them to come to the station. She didn't tell them why. Couldn't. Not over the phone. When they arrived, Helen immediately, Patricia within 20 minutes, Reynolds sat them down in her office and said the words they'd waited their entire adult lives to hear. "We know who took your daughters." The discovery truth. On May 15, 2025 at 6:47 a.m., a tactical team from the Kentucky State Police and FBI executed a no-knock warrant at Thomas Wayne Carver's residence in Lexington. The apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a complex near New Circle Road, the kind of place where neighbors didn't know each other's names. Carver was asleep when they breached the door, was pinned to his bed before he could fully wake, was in handcuffs before he could process what was happening. Thomas Wayne Carver, you're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Sarah Lynn Brewster and Kelly Jo Parsons. According to the arrest report, Carver went completely still, didn't struggle, didn't speak, just stared at the ceiling of his bedroom while agents searched his apartment, boxing up computers, papers, photographs, anything that might contain evidence. In a storage unit rented under Carver's name 3 miles away, investigators found 3 plastic bins. Inside those bins, wrapped in trash bags and sealed in Tupperware containers, more evidence. Clothing that was sent immediately for analysis. Jewelry identified by Patricia Brewster as Sarah Lynn's, a small gold cross necklace her grandmother had given her for her 13th birthday. A purple hair scrunchie that Helen Parsons recognized as Kelly Jo's favorite, the one she wore constantly. And a journal. A spiral notebook, its pages filled with Thomas Carver's handwriting, entries dating from 1987 to 2003. A catalog of his thoughts, his justifications, his memories of what he'd done. The journal was the confession they needed to understand. Detective Webb read it first, in an interview room in the Lexington Police Department, wearing latex gloves, turning pages he wanted to burn. The writing was neat, controlled. No erratic scrawling, no obvious mental instability, just explanation, as if Carver were documenting something ordinary. The first entry was dated June 2, 1987, 5 days after the girls disappeared. I keep thinking about how easy it was, how they trusted me. Sarah Lynn knew me from the garage. I'd fixed James's truck before. She recognized me when I pulled over on 421, asked if they needed a ride. It was getting dark. Kelly Jo was tired. She said yes before Sarah Lynn could object. Webb had to stop reading, had to set the journal down and breathe through the nausea rising in his throat. But he continued, because someone had to witness this. Someone had to know. According to Carver's journal, meticulously detailed, he'd been driving on Highway 421 that evening, had seen the girls walking toward the trestle, had followed at a distance, had watched them walk out onto the bridge, had parked his truck, a dark blue Ford F-150 that no one had reported seeing because no one had thought to ask about vehicles that belonged, and approached on foot. He'd talked to them, been friendly. Sarah Lynn had recognized him. Mr. Carver, hey, which had made it easier. He'd told them he'd give them a ride home, that it was getting late, that their parents would be worried. Kelly Jo had agreed immediately. Sarah Lynn had hesitated, but only for a moment. Because this was Harlan in 1987, and Thomas Carver was someone they knew, someone trusted. They'd never made it into the truck. I couldn't let them get in the truck, the journal read. Once we left the trestle area, someone might see them with me. Had to be there. Had to be fast. The details that followed were clinical. detached. Carver described attacking both girls on the embankment below the trestle using a tire iron from his truck. Sarah Lynn first, because she was bigger, stronger, more likely to fight effectively. Then Kelly Jo, who'd tried to run, who'd lost her shoe scrambling up the incline. He described wrapping their bodies in a tarp from his truck bed. Described carrying them, one at a time, through the woods to an old mining access road a quarter-mile away. Described loading them into his truck under cover of full darkness and driving to a location he'd scouted weeks earlier, an abandoned mining operation called the Kettle Creek site, 15 miles into the mountains, accessible only by logging roads most people had forgotten existed. There was a vertical shaft, the journal read. Old coal exploration from the 40s. They'd never capped it properly, just covered it with rotten boards and left it. I moved the boards. The shaft was at least 150 feet deep, probably deeper. I couldn't see the bottom, even with a flashlight. He described dropping their bodies into that shaft. Described hearing nothing when they hit bottom, the darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Described replacing the boards, covering them with dirt and branches, making the site look undisturbed. No one will ever find them, he'd written. The mine maps from that era are incomplete. Most people don't even know Kettle Creek exists. In a few years, the forest will reclaim everything. It'll be like they were never there. For 38 years, he'd been right. The journal entries continued sporadically over the years. Sometimes months would pass between writings. Sometimes he'd write multiple entries in a week. The tone remained disturbingly matter-of-fact, as if he were documenting a project rather than murder. In 1989, when he'd moved away from Harlan, distance feels necessary. People are starting to look at everyone differently. Better to be somewhere else. Start over. I'll always know what I did, but they never will. In 1995, saw a news story about the anniversary. They still haven't found them. Patricia Brewster was interviewed, still looking for answers. I felt nothing watching her. Is that what guilt is supposed to feel like? Nothing? In 2003, the final entry. I'm stopping this journal. Too risky to keep. Everything's in my head anyway. I remember every detail, every moment, the weight of them, the sound, the silence after. I carry it all, and no one knows. Maybe that's my sentence. To know and carry it alone. But he hadn't destroyed the journal, hadn't thrown away the evidence stored in his unit. Perhaps some part of him wanted to be caught. Perhaps the weight had become too heavy. Perhaps he simply never imagined that science would advance enough to reach back across 4 decades and find him. On May 16th, with the journal and physical evidence secured, Sheriff Reynolds and Agent Kim drove to the Kettle Creek site. It took 4 hours to find it, even with Carver's detailed descriptions. The logging roads had become overgrown, barely passable. The site itself was exactly as he'd described, a small clearing, trees pressing in from all sides, and in the center, hidden under 40 years of leaf litter and new growth, the barely visible remnants of boards covering a dark opening in the ground. The recovery operation began immediately. Kentucky State Police, FBI, a specialized team of mine rescue experts who could safely descend a vertical shaft that hadn't been maintained since the 1940s. It took 2 days to secure the shaft, install proper equipment, and prepare for recovery. On May 18, 2025, 2 members of the recovery team descended into the shaft. At approximately 178 feet below the surface, they found human remains. 2 sets. Partially skeletonized but preserved enough by the shaft's unique conditions, cool, dry, isolated from scavengers, for positive identification. Dental records confirmed what DNA would later verify Sarah Lynn Brewster and Kelly Jo Parsons had been found. The news broke nationally on May 19th. Kentucky cold case solved after 38 years. Remains found. Suspect arrested. Every major news outlet picked it up. The story had everything: small-town tragedy, decades of mystery, cutting-edge forensic science, family perseverance. It became a moment, a headline, a podcast episode waiting to happen. But in Harlan, it wasn't a story. It was an ending they'd stopped believing would come. Aftermath and reflection. Patricia Brewster was in her kitchen when Sheriff Reynolds called with the confirmation. She'd been making coffee, the morning ritual unchanged by 4 decades. When Reynolds said, "We found them, Patricia. We found your Sarah Lynn," the coffee pot slipped from her hands and shattered on the linoleum floor. She didn't notice the hot coffee burning her feet through her slippers. Didn't notice Michael suddenly beside her, having driven through the night from Louisville when he'd heard about the arrest. She sank into a chair and wept. Not the wild, desperate grief of 1987, but something deeper, quieter. The grief of finally being allowed to let go. Helen Parsons was at the church where she'd been every morning for 38 years, lighting candles and praying for the impossible. When the sheriff found her there, Helen already knew somehow. Mothers always know. She looked at Reynolds and said simply, "Is she coming home?" When Reynolds nodded, Helen closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you." Later, she would say she wasn't sure who she was thanking. God, the sheriff, Kelly Jo herself for waiting, for staying findable. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfort. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Karen Reeves led the analysis. Despite the decades and conditions, she was able to determine causes of death. Blunt force trauma to the skulls, consistent with the attack described in Carver's journal. There were other injuries, too. Defensive wounds on Sarah Lynn's forearms where she'd tried to protect herself, evidence of the terror of those final moments. The jewelry and clothing items from Carver's storage unit were processed. DNA from Sarah Lynn matched her mother and brother. DNA from Kelly Jo matched her mother. The evidence web was absolute, irrefutable. Thomas Wayne Carver was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of evidence tampering and abuse of a corpse. In a preliminary hearing on June 3, 2025, he sat silently, his attorney entering a not guilty plea despite the overwhelming evidence. He'd said almost nothing since his arrest beyond requesting a lawyer. His eyes, according to courtroom observers, were empty, not defiant, not remorseful, just empty. The trial was scheduled for October 2025. The prosecutor, Commonwealth Attorney, Jennifer Holcomb, had stated publicly that they would seek the maximum sentence possible: life without parole. Kentucky hadn't executed anyone since 2008, and death penalty cases had become rare, but she made it clear that every option was on the table. But the trial didn't matter to Harlan the way the discovery did. What mattered was that Sarah Lynn and Kelly Jo were coming home. On June 20th, 2025, Harlan held a funeral. 2 caskets, white, covered in flowers, surrounded by photographs from lives stopped at 14. The church was standing room only, filled with people who'd searched in 1987 and people who'd been born since. The pastor, new to the community, had asked the older congregants to help him understand who these girls had been. He spoke of Sarah Lynn's basketball skills, her meticulous planning, her laughter, of Kelly Jo's loyalty, her dreams, her purple hair scrunchie. He spoke of a community that had never stopped loving them, never stopped looking. Patricia sat in the front pew, Michael on one side, her 2 grandchildren on the other. She'd placed Sarah Lynn's basketball in the casket, along with the notebook of financial calculations, the dreams of a 16-year-old who never got to buy her car. Helen sat across the aisle, alone by choice. she'd placed Kelly Jo's Keds in the casket, not the one from the embankment, but the matching shoe they'd found in Kelly Jo's closet, preserved all these years. So, she wouldn't be missing it anymore. The burial was in Rest Haven Cemetery, on a hillside overlooking the valley. 2 plots side by side, markers engraved with their names, their 2 short dates, and a single phrase, "Together, always." The town planted 2 more dogwood trees beside the cemetery entrance, made plans for a permanent memorial at the site of the old trestle once the structure was finally torn down, established scholarships in both girls' names for Harlan High students. But the healing would be complicated. Detective Webb struggled with questions he couldn't answer. How had they missed Carver in 1987? He'd been interviewed, cleared, forgotten. What signs had they missed? What questions should they have asked? The rational part of his mind knew they'd done everything possible with the tools available then. But the part that had found that shoe, that had spent 38 years wondering, couldn't quite forgive the miss. The town grappled with betrayal. Thomas Carver had been one of them, had lived among them, worked alongside them, been trusted by them. Parents who'd brought their cars to his garage, who'd chatted with him about the weather and work and the state of the mines, felt sick remembering those conversations. How had they not seen it? How had evil worn such an ordinary face? The truth that emerged from psychological profiles of Carver was unsettling in its banality. He wasn't a monster from outside their community. He was a product of it. A man who'd lived an entire life of quiet, rage and impulse that erupted once and then retreated back into normalcy. Who'd functioned in society, held jobs, maintained relationships, all while carrying the memory of what he'd done like a secret stone in his pocket. Dr. Michelle Torres, a forensic psychologist who evaluated Carver for the prosecution, would later say in an interview, "We want monsters to look like monsters. We want evil to be obvious, identifiable, something we can point to and say, there." But evil is often mundane. It's the person next to you in line at the grocery store. It's the mechanic who fixes your car. It's the neighbor who waves hello. That's the truly terrifying thing, that it can hide so well. Harlan had to live with that knowledge, had to reconcile the fact that for 2 years they'd lived alongside Sarah Lynn and Kelly Jo's killer without knowing, that he'd perhaps been at the vigils, had maybe even helped search, hiding in plain sight behind a mask of concern. But they also had to live with something else. They'd never given up. The memorial trees had never been removed. The case had never been officially closed. Parents had told the story to their children, keeping the memory alive. And when technology finally caught up, when science finally reached back across the decades, Harlan had been ready. Patricia Brewster would say in an interview 6 months later, "I used to think closure meant forgetting, moving on. But it doesn't. Closure is just knowing. Finally knowing. I'll grieve Sarah Lynn until I die. But now I grieve her body coming home, not lost in the dark somewhere. That difference matters." Helen Parsons planted a garden behind her apartment building. Purple flowers, petunias, irises, lavender. Kelly Jo's favorite color. She tended it daily, pulling weeds, deadheading blooms, talking to her daughter in the quiet morning hours before the world woke up. Michael Brewster brought his children to Harlan more often, showed them the memorial trees, the cemetery, told them about the aunt they'd never met, but who'd shaped their existence nonetheless. His daughter Sarah, age 8, asked once, "Do you think she's proud of us?" Michael had answered, "I think she'd be happy we remember." The trial, when it happened in November 2025, was brief. Carver's defense attorney, recognizing the impossibility of acquittal, negotiated a plea, guilty to all charges in exchange for removing the death penalty from consideration. On November 18th, Thomas Wayne Carver stood before Judge Patricia Morrison and formally admitted to murdering Sarah Lynn Brewster and Kelly Jo Parsons on May 28, 1987. He was sentenced to 2 life terms without possibility of parole, plus 140 years for the additional charges, all to be served consecutively. He would die in prison. That was certain. At the sentencing, Patricia Brewster was given the opportunity to speak. She stood slowly, her arthritis making movement difficult, and faced the man who'd killed her daughter. "You took Sarah Lynn's whole life," she said, her voice steady. "You took her future, her dreams, her chance to be more than 14. But you didn't take our love for her. You didn't take her memory. You didn't take what she meant to this community. You took everything from her, but she left something behind anyway. She left us knowing that love outlasts evil, that memory outlasts death, that eventually, always eventually, the truth comes out. You'll die in prison forgotten. She'll live forever remembered. That's justice." Helen Parsons chose not to speak, simply sat in the gallery, holding a photo of Kelly Jo, letting her presence be enough. As autumn turned to winter in Harlan, life found its new rhythm. The story began to fade from national headlines, became another entry in the catalog of solved cold cases that occasionally surfaced in true crime podcasts or documentary series. But in Harlan, it remained immediate. The mountains still held the town in their cupped palm. The sun still set behind the western ridges, painting the valleys in familiar shadows. The seasons still turned, dogwoods blooming each spring in cycles that predated human grief and would continue long after. But something had shifted. The open wound had scarred. The question mark that had hung over the town for 38 years had been replaced with a period. On a morning in December, Patricia stood at the end of Clover Street as she'd done for 4 decades. But this time, when she looked at the mountains, she didn't search them for answers. She simply saw them, ancient, beautiful, indifferent. She thought about Sarah Lynn, about the girl who'd planned her future in careful notebooks, who'd threaded impossible passes through defensive lines, who'd laughed with her best friend on a Thursday evening in May. She thought about how time is both cruel and merciful. Cruel in its relentless forward motion, pulling us away from those we've lost. Merciful in its ability to soften even the sharpest pain into something bearable, something that becomes part of us rather than something that destroys us. She thought about how justice delayed is still justice, how some questions take decades to answer, how the arc of truth is long but bends toward revelation. And then she walked back to her house, where coffee was waiting and the day was beginning, and life, that persistent, stubborn thing, continued. Closing reflection. There are stories we tell ourselves about evil, that it's aberrant, exceptional, something that happens elsewhere to other people. Harlan, Kentucky learned differently, learned that evil can be ordinary, can wear a familiar face, can live next door for years without revealing itself. But Harlan also learned something else, that love persists beyond death, that communities can hold grief without being destroyed by it, and that even after 4 decades, even when all hope seems lost, truth can still find its way into light. Sarah Lynn Brewster and Kelly Jo Parsons were 14 years old when they vanished into a spring evening in 1987. They would never graduate high school, never fall in love, never have careers or families or futures, but they were not forgotten. In a very real sense, they shaped their town's identity, became part of its collective memory, gave their community something to carry and remember, and, finally, to lay to rest. The mountains remain, The railroad trestle will eventually be torn down, but the memorial will stay. The dogwood trees bloom each May, white petals opening like small lights in the darkness. And in Harlan, on quiet evenings when the cicadas start their song and twilight holds the valley in that suspended moment between day and night, people sometimes pause and remember two girls who laughed and dreamed and deserved so much more than they got. But they also remember something else, that their community never stopped looking, never stopped caring, never let them disappear completely. That matters. In a world where too many vanish into silence, where too many cases go forever unsolved, where too many families never get answers, that matters. Every case on this channel takes weeks of research, hours of writing, and the emotional weight of bearing witness to tragedy. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice or memory or the people in your own life you'd never stop searching for, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this case affected you most: the family's perseverance, the forensic science that finally solved it, or something else entirely. In the end, this is what we owe to the lost: to remember them as they were, not just how they died, to speak their names, to tell their stories, to insist that they mattered, that their absence left a hole that could never quite be filled, and that love, stubborn, persistent, undimmable love, outlasts even the longest darkness. Sarah Lynn Brewster, Kelly Jo Parsons, remembered, always.